Your hand finds the key, but the whole garage has gone still. Your sleeve grazes the paperwork, but your hand keeps moving for the door. You touch the key again, but your hand still refuses the last inch. The fresh battery looks almost rude beside wiring that slept 20 years. Then the cracked seat exhales dust, and the cabin feels strangely occupied. Everyone goes quieter than before, because now silence sounds like a warning. Fuel hangs in the air, and cold metal makes your stomach tighten. For a second, your right hand shakes harder once it touches the key. Then you glance at the paperwork as if paper could bless what follows. When everyone stops moving, you feel their faith become another weight. When you glance up, even the boots by the bench seem to brace. When you lean over the bay, the fuel smell says maybe, not yet. Then the paperwork on the fender reminds you this start must mean something. The gauges stay pinned at nothing, because they still owe you an answer. So you start to turn the key, and your wrist betrays you first. You touch the cracked wheel because faith needs somewhere physical to sit. And cold metal. So the moment turns real all at once. Soft. For a second the starter grinds, and the whole car wakes without breathing. For a second, your right hand shakes hard enough to feel watched, but you stop before cranking, as if failure could hear you thinking. But when it stops, pause. You listen harder, because failure always sounds personal. So you draw one breath, and the key begins to turn further. After one slow breath, you turn farther, and the silence starts to break. By the time you breathe again, a tiny tremor near the carburetor pulls you forward. Then one folded page catches your eye, because the crease hides a fingerprint smear. Then your boot nudges a bright drip, and suddenly the silence feels deliberate. But when the cough dies instantly, your confidence drops harder than the silence. For a second, it feels less like dust and more like someone waited. You lean closer because that thin, wet line leads back to the carburetor. Then the still boots beside the fender make you feel suddenly watched. When your hand finds the wheel, the cold rim because the fuel smell turns sweet enough. For a second, you wonder if you've overfed it. Scrap. By the time you sit down, their silence feels heavier than the starter. You cannot read the faded writing, but it feels meant for this night. For a second, you hear your father's warning about forcing old things awake. So you raise the key slowly, but your right hand trembles anyway. So the car stops being a project and starts acting like a kept promise. So the car stops feeling stubborn and starts feeling uncomfortably like you. After all these months, turning it now feels like admitting what you need. When you glance up, even the others seem careful not to interrupt it. After another breath, your fingertip finds the note about a gentler throttle. Then the starter drags through the silence, and something inside answers once. By the time your hand steadies, you only dare change one tiny thing. By the time you ease the linkage back, your hand is shaking worse. But that single cough leaves a scent of promise, and you lean closer. After that, you slide back inside, and the key feels heavier again. When you slide back behind the wheel, the key suddenly feels heavier. But the fuel smell turns sharper, and suddenly confidence feels embarrassingly thin. But the smell turns sweeter now, and that suddenly worries you more. But the fresh fuel smell turns sour when you notice a dark, wet seam. Then you notice a dark drip below, because old victories always invoice themselves. Then you notice fresh dampness beneath the carburetor, like a quiet confession. Then your thumb holds a rag there, because any spark now feels personal. For a second, your notes look less like guidance and more like witnesses. For a second, your hand freezes, because leaks make hope feel reckless. For a second, a tiny tick under the hood sounds like someone warning you. By the time you reach the seat, their silence weighs more than advice. When you glance at the old paperwork, your father feels uncomfortably close. When you flatten the old paperwork, it offers dates and names, but no mercy. When your thumb finds the key again, your father's patience comes back first. After all this care, backing away would cost less than failing again. By the time you look down, even the other boots have stopped shifting. After all this time, pinch the linkage
failing
light,
now
and the engine seems to listen,
and succeeding
so you
almost
nudge
worse.
the linkage once, gently, like admitting you might have rushed. Then a faint twitch at the linkage suggests the car is listening back. By the time you reach the key, your wrist is already trembling. After that, the key feels heavier, because this try can embarrass more than silence. So you draw one breath and turn further. Pause before the doubt can object. But somewhere under the silence, another answer gathers before you turn. And when you start to turn it, something in the hood answers first. You finally step back, because the silence now feels louder than failure. You step back from the Mustang, because staying suddenly feels more humiliating. But your hand leaves the key, because quitting suddenly feels cleaner than hoping. Then your hand leaves the key, but your wrist keeps remembering the strain. Then your boot nudges the old paperwork, and one folded corner lifts. Then the garage goes so still that even your boots sound disloyal. For a second, the loose paperwork shifts, and you look down anyway. For a second,
you
the
almost
keychain
ignore
glints
it,
beside
but
the
the date
paperwork and
stings.
stops you. By the time you lift it, a tiny photo changes what this car was. When you unfold it under the lamp, a child's sketch falls free. When you lift the curled note, a second key mark changes everything. It stops being your test, because suddenly it feels like someone waited. You see this car drawn running, so the silence stops feeling final. Because the silence was chosen, not surrendered. Someone had disabled it gently. When you lean inside, a brittle toy under the seat answers why. By the time your hand returns, the key feels less like proof. So your fingers return to the engine, softer now, almost apologizing as they reconnected. So your last adjustment turns gentle, like asking permission instead of proving anything. After one tiny twist on the distributor, the engine answers before thought. By the time you slide back inside, fear feels sharper because hope returned. After that, you reach for the key again, and this time listen first. But as the whole body shudders awake, your fingers hover, not turning
Then
away.
the whole fastback
After
shivers
all that,
gently,
you turn
and
the
your
key
chest
again,
finally
and the whole
unclenches.
garage leans
But you do
in.
not
Smile yet, because the rhythm still sounds borrowed. Then it catches unevenly, and your whole chest forgets how to breathe. For a second, the exhaust stumbles, but it keeps choosing the next breath. Then the needles tremble in place, and your chest tightens with them. For a second, the garage stays frozen, but the exhaust keeps speaking. You listen harder than you think, because this sound is judging you too. For a second, pale exhaust lifts through the lamp glow like proof. Your right hand hovers near the key, because saving it still matters. By the time the gauges tremble steady, relief already feels strangely dangerous. When it keeps breathing, you hear your pride inside the relief too clearly. But hearing it idle makes every patient night behind you feel answerable. When your hand hovers near the key, You remember why silence hurt. So your hand drifts back to the key, almost grateful, almost afraid. When the rhythm steadies, you hear your own need inside it too. After everything,
After all those
you choose
months,
mercy first,
shutting it
and
down
ease
now
the idol
feels
down.
almost like betrayal.
By the time you glance at the paperwork, proof is already idling. But the thin smoke in lamplight warns that love can still overreach. By the time it settles, the softer note feels even more personal. So instead of hutting it down, you let your hand fall away. So you let it idle one careful heartbeat longer and keep listening. But you leave it running one breath longer, listening for what comes next. After 20 years of silence, you decide it deserves one full